Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for day number 3 of the America's Challengers Tournament. We are in the final day of the round robin stage here. This is going to determine the 2 teams that are going to be eliminated first, of course, from the tournament, and of the top 4 that are going to go into the bracket, play some best of 3s, hopefully try to get into some best of 5s. I'm excited to see where that ends up going, but a couple of teams already locked in, one team really already eliminated. There is still a lot to play for. There are 3 teams fighting for 2 spots in the middle of the standings, and we're going to know pretty quickly where those lie because of the way that these matchups go. But of course, if you are excited, let me know down in the comment section below. If you want to know my thoughts on the first 2 days, check out the playlist up in the iCard. You can check out day 1 or day 2 up there, of course, but today, we are going to be going over the 5 games that we got in the final day of that round robin stage, like we said here on day number 3. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. If you are new here, what we are going to do is, of course, go game by game, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game, and at the end of the video, we will be talking about the bracket. We will know our first 2 teams eliminated and the 4 teams that will be moving on to the best of 3 stage at the very least. So excited to get into that, but of course most of today will be spent talking about the final games here of this round robin stage. So without further ado, let's get right into it. Our first game is a majorly important one. It's one of the few matchups between teams that are fighting it out for those final 2 spots here on the final day of the round robin stage. It's a matchup between Dragonsteel and VKS Academy, and VKS picks up a gigantic win here. Dragonsteel really not doing themselves any favors through the first couple of days, but this is the loss that if they do end up missing out on top 4, they are going to look back on and say that they needed to be able to pick up a win here. They knew the stakes. Going into this, you knew that if you were to lose to a team like VKS, that all of a sudden it becomes out of your hands. Depending on what happens later on in the day with Fuego, you could potentially have just knocked yourself out of the top 4 right now with this singular loss, and it's just been really disappointing to watch Dragonsteel at this tournament not have the same kind of success they were able to have domestically. We talked about them a ton, covering the NACL all year long, but let's not make this a negative towards Dragonsteel. Let's make this a positive for VKS, who very likely lock in their spot here into the top 4. This was a great performance, and obviously as the number 1 seed from the hosting region, you would have hoped that they would perform well, but it is very likely that Brazil is one of the few regions actually putting 2 teams into the top 4, which is very shocking. Like, I know a lot of people saw them as the second best region coming into this tournament, but they have not performed like that at all. Quite frankly, they have been the best region at this tournament. I think that has become very clear, and honestly, a player that we were really looking forward to potentially seeing pop off at this tournament really is right now, that being Kisei in the mid lane. This time on the Yone, he's a side lane god. Like, that is really what we are learning about him throughout this tournament, is that there is nobody else at this tournament, either in the top lane or in the mid lane, that is nearly as proficient at generating resources in side lanes. I'm not going to call it like Chovy-esque, but it's that style of play where you just need to accumulate resources over the course of the game, and then finally in these late game team fights, you're just going to be able to take over. You're just at such a gold lead, and you can wallet diff basically anybody that you're playing into, and he has the mechanics to back it up. Obviously, I'm not calling him Chovy, but that style of play, I think, is what I would most akin Kisei to, but he has really been awesome. He just gapped Spyrax, who is one of the more consistent mid laners in the North American Challengers League, and so this is just a really big performance. I know the stat line might not, like, blow you away. He does have these, like, golden XP leads at 15 because he is really good at generating resources, but he's not going to have the highest KP. He's not going to have the highest damage numbers in the world because he's not involved in a lot of the early game, but once you do get to the part of the game where he can start taking over, he is by far the most essential player here on VKS. I do want to give a couple of shout outs here. Sorolu in the jungle was excellent once again. The Elise continues to be a pretty gigantic pick for them. It's clear that they are just most comfortable playing games out from relative snowball positions. I think, Elise is one of those champions that I think would function a lot worse at a higher level when you're playing against teams that are a little bit more adept at just taking her out of the game, even in the early game, because not everything she does is free. You do have a lot of options and a lot of tools at your disposal, but sometimes it just doesn't end up working out. And so I do think that Elise is not something that I'm expecting to, like, break through the entire meta, but VKS is very, very comfortable playing around a champion like that in the early game, and he continues to get a lot of pressure, and he's still was relevant throughout the mid game as well, which I think is really impressive on Elise. And then Telas in the support position is the other player that I absolutely want to shout out. A couple of fantastic rel engages that really set up the entire team to be able to follow through in these 5v5. So those are the three players. Morteus, I think, also played well on the Jhin. He's clearly very adept at Jhin. I would imagine this is his most played champion because he just felt very comfortable on it throughout this entire game. But VKS in general just looking like a well-oiled unit. It feels like they found their playstyle of trying to snowball games out of control, which is what worked for them in the finals when I watched them win over Pain Academy, and it looks like they've been able to translate that now to the back half of this round robin stage. This is a very scary team. They're coming in as the #1 seed from CBLOL Academy, and they are very much making it known that they deserve to be considered, right up there with anybody else at this tournament. But for Dragonsteel, like I said, this is about as disappointing of a loss as you could possibly get in this scenario. Really nothing positive to say about this team. They kept themselves in the game. They weren't horrible, but they have this, 5v5 comp that they really want to try to execute with Fuego plus Ori and potentially like Varus setups. You have Poppy to try to negate, potential Yone and Rel impact, but none of it really ends up working out. Both of these teams very much want to play this front-to-back style in the back half, and quite frankly, Dragonsteel just executed it a lot worse. The Yone was by far the most useful champion in the game, and you didn't really have anyone that could ever answer him. Not only that, but it felt like you were way too passive in terms of your decision making over the course of this game, and I think it really came out in a couple of areas. Dud of the game for me is going to go to Zamudo. This is the first time where it's really been like, oh, Zamudo was scouted and his tendencies were used against him in this game. He is known to freeze waves and to try to isolate the top lane matchup, let it push in, try to make the enemy top laner struggle as much in the 1v1 as he possibly can, and that's really worked at the North American Tier 2 level. But, VKS very much had the scouting report, and instead of just kind of letting that happen to Tyrion and not really helping the Cassante out at all, they decided, well, what if we just dove top over and over again? What if we made sure to punish Zamudo every single time he tried to freeze this wave? And that's exactly what they did. They punished him every single time, and Zamudo was never really relevant in the game. The other player that I think really struggled here was Spyrax in the mid lane. We already talked about Kisse being really good on the other side of this matchup, but Spyrax on the Orianna just wasn't able to do all that much to be able to answer. He was down thousands of gold in the mid game here, and he just never really was able to keep up. The Yone getting way too many resources in a side lane, and Spyrax was never able to actually compete with that. So kind of a frustrating game here, I would say, from Dragonsteel, but it's even more frustrating considering the context. Losing here is about as disastrous as it gets, and unfortunately, it really does expose that, Dragonsteel wasn't quite this perfect team that we kind of saw from them in the NACL. It's obviously very different, and I've seen this in the comment section. It's very different to play on stage in a big arena, like they are here in Brazil at an international tournament, than it is to play a lot of the season at home and really just play one series in Los Angeles. But overall, I think Dragonsteel still has a lot to build upon, and even if they don't end up making top 4 at this tournament, hopefully we can still reflect on a lot of this year as a success. But for VKS, this is a gigantic win. Again, Brazil showing up in their home region. Kisse has looked amazing over the last 2 days in particular, and I think this team has a lot going for them. My only question for them is going to be, how do they respond when they don't win in the early game? I think that could potentially be a problem for them moving forward, but at least for now, if they are able to play their style, they're likely going to be able to beat almost anybody at this tournament. But then moving on to our second game of the day, and we could know our top 4 teams by the end of this game, and in fact, we will, because it was Fear x Starforge taking on Fuego. And Fuego is going to pick up a gigantic victory for themselves as the other of the 3 teams that is competing for one of those final 2 spots. Them winning here secures it. They move to 3-1 through their first 4 games. They give Fear their first loss of the entire tournament, and now we are sitting here, and unfortunately, I have to say, Dragonsteel has now been eliminated from being able to make it into the top 4. They are guaranteed bottom 2 with this Fuego win. The only way for Dragonsteel to have made it into the top 4 after that loss in the first game against VKS was for Fuego to lose here, and then for Dragonsteel to beat Fuego later on in the day, but that is no longer an option. Even if Dragonsteel is able to win, they will have a worse record, now sitting at 1-3. And Fuego sitting at 3-1, and so congrats to Fuego. We did not expect LATAM teams to show up at this tournament, but Fuego, the super team, the one that people were really talking up, they have absolutely delivered. They have been one of the more fun teams to watch at this tournament, and quite frankly, this game was an absolute banger. Fear did some things right, did some things wrong, I think ended up just not being quite as clinical, not quite as clean as Fuego was in some of the key moments on the other side of this matchup, but this was a back and forth game. Do not get it twisted. This was not one of those games in performances where, you know, Fear just didn't show up and weren't good in any aspect. This was very, very close, and it came down to some really minute, you know, differences, I would say, between the two teams. But player of the game pretty much has to go to Mataz in the jungle. What a performance from him. I mean, XU has been on a roll at this tournament so far. 3 games before this, 3 player of the games for XU, at least in terms of the broadcast. And Mataz just came out on the Fuego and outplayed him, basically in every aspect. XU was not particularly good in this game on the brand. I think the Fuego was constantly able to control every part of the map. I talk about a thing called tempo and pressure. Like, those words I use on this channel a lot, and I'm sure a lot of you already know what they mean, but this, if you ever want an example of how, you know, a jungler can exude tempo and pressure for their team regardless of the game state that, you know, their team is in, this is the performance to look at for that, because Mataz was about as perfect as you can get in that regard on the Fuego, just constantly being in the right place at the right time and being able to create opportunities for the team to be able to take advantage of that other junglers just wouldn't be able to create. Really, really great game coming in from him. But it wasn't just him. Yone continues to look like a pretty amazing pick on this patch and in this tournament. Zelt had another really good game. I think he's been very fun to watch over the course of this tournament. You know, the Corki was very fed on the other side of this matchup. Constantly, a Blaze Olive was cleaning up a lot of these fights in the mid game that actually were going in favor of Fear, but Zelt just continuing to hang on and continuing to build a resume and eventually hitting some really clutch ultimates down the stretch here to be able to set up a lot of the damage coming in from Fuego or Kaisa, and obviously to deal a lot of damage himself down the stretch. I thought ADD was pretty solid. This is probably his best game of the tournament up until this point. I think he's been rather invisible across this tournament so far, but this was pretty okay from him. Baolo was great in the support position. Virus FX was pretty solid here on the Kaisa. Just a good game overall from Fuego. There are some mistakes, generally speaking, in some of the mid-game fights. They were just out-mechanicked in a lot of instances, but because they were more clinical, because they were more clean in the back half of this game, they were still able to be able to walk out of this with a victory. Really great stuff from Fuego to secure their spot, not only in the top 4, but potentially, like, they still have an option to be a top 2 seed coming out of this group stage. So really great stuff from Fuego, but for Fear, pretty disappointing loss here. I think, you know, maybe you call this a tactical loss because it knocks Dragonsteel out of the tournament, but, you know, it definitely probably wasn't what they were looking for. I think this team honestly wanted to go undefeated in the main stage here. I think they wanted to prove to everybody that they were the best team at this tournament, and unfortunately, that just didn't exactly happen here. You lose one pivotal fight down the stretch, you end up getting out macroed in a couple of small areas, and eventually the game is just kind of busted wide open. It is what it is. I do think the hands definitely still showed up in this game. You have players like a Blaze Olive, Instinct, Winsome, Phillip to an extent that were really good in some of these fights and were creating a lot of action, but again, it's all just about being pulled apart in a couple of scenarios that I don't think you can really get away with. Phillip is going to get done of the game for that on the Renekton. You know, I thought he was really good when he was at fights. He was like the only, you know, starter, if you will, for this team. Like, Rel obviously can start fights and has the opportunity to start fights in a couple of, you know, parts of this game. But for the most part, Winsome was on peel duty to try to make sure that the Corki, the Ziggs, the Brand had options in the back half here. It was up to the Renekton to be kind of that flank threat. And the problem for Fear is that Fuego kept finding avenues and opportunities to take these 5v4s without the Renekton there. And that's really where they were able to get a lot of their minor leads. And Phillip not being a part of a lot of these fights was kind of game losing overall for Fear, even if he was pretty good in some of those actual engages. I already talked about it. XU was also, in my opinion, not particularly good in terms of controlling the map in this game. I do think that this is his weakest performance at the tournament up until this point. Hopefully he can be better. Brand was still very useful in terms of the damage, but the kind of the macro part of jungle, I just think he got outplayed by Mataz in this game. ABO was really good at cleaning up kills in a lot of these fights, is always very good at, you know, getting resources for himself, but just didn't have enough firepower in the back half. He dies first in the pivotal fight that ends the game. Instinct was really good in this game on the Ziggs, just not a lot to do, and as I said, Winsome, not really like an eye-opening kind of game, was mostly trying to protect a lot of the carries from taking a ton of damage early on in these fights. Fear was fine in this game, but this is a team they should be beating. At least on paper, you would expect them to be better than Fuego, and even if they were able to out-hands Fuego, to get out-brained a bit by Fuego in this game is really not ideal. I think that there are some things that they need to clean up. They are obviously already locked into the top 4. They were undefeated going into this game, but losing it here I don't think was ideal for them. But this is gigantic for Fuego, a team that continues to overperform my expectations. They are genuinely very, very good, and they're a team that you have to watch for the rest of the tournament. I don't really know how things are going to shake out in terms of the seeding. There is still a lot to play for at the end of the day for that, but Fuego certainly putting themselves in a position where they have to be taken seriously right now. But then moving on to game number 3, and this one was supposed to be a big determiner over the course of this day to kind of show who might be the team that ends up sliding into that final spot, but instead we had already had this determined, and this is just for pride at this point. It's Fuego taking on Dragonsteel. And Dragonsteel is going to pick up the win here. It's more of a pride victory, like I said, than anything else. Fuego having to play 2 games in a row, I'm sure, is a bit more difficult for them. Maybe it locks them in more, who knows. But these were back-to-back pretty long games. 34 minutes isn't like crazy, but back-to-back pretty intense games, and unfortunately they can't come away with a win in both of them. But Dragonsteel picking up a win on their way out of the tournament. It's just unfortunate how things ended up going for them here. I think them not being able to convert against some teams that they quite frankly just should be able to beat, it's definitely going to haunt them, and I think they're going to have a lot to work on going back to North America, going back to the United States, but at least they were able to get a win here. Player of the game is very, very obviously, to me, going to go to Scary Jerry in the bot lane. Great performance from him. I continue to be a very big Scary Jerry, believer. I've talked about it for a while. I don't think that there is a Masu in the NACL right now. It's not like last year where Masu as an AD carry was so prepared for the LCS that it was just a no-brainer that he needed to be starting for a top-tier LCS team. He came in and, he was about what we could have asked him to be, I guess. Maybe the expectations were just too high. I thought he was going to blow away Rookie of the Year, but he was still really good at the LCS level. By, now, by the end of the year, he's become one of the better AD carries in North America. We all kind of expected that. There isn't a Masu in the NACL right now, but Scary Jerry, in my opinion, is as close as we have. I think that he is the best ADC prospect in North America at the current moment, and I do believe that he can play quite a variety of different things, as evidenced here by the Ziggs, and I do think that he's able to play out a lot of these early states incredibly efficiently. When you're looking across the map at Smolder plus Corki plus Brand, they're not going to be able to contest the Ziggs all that much in the early game. You have to be able to take advantage of his, uniqueness, I guess, in terms of what he offers as a champion, especially if you're going to pair it up with something like Tristana. You got to take every tower in the game. That has to be the objective as early as possible, and Jerry, I think, did that. But look at the damage numbers at the end of this. He was highest damage in the game by almost double. He was genuinely ridiculous on the Ziggs. When that champion is played correctly and when he's able to be put into a good spot with a lot of gold, he can absolutely obliterate basically any team in the entire world. So great performance from Jerry. Zyko obviously deserves a lot of praise for that as well. Really like Zyko. I think both of these two should be in the LCS next year. We'll see if that ends up happening with the league contracting a bit. But Zamudo, a great game here on the Garen. This was a gigantic top gap. Getting that R5 counter pick and ADD blind picking the Jax, I think, was a pretty gigantic mistake. We will definitely talk about that more, but Zamudo probably playing his best game at this tournament. There were a lot of expectations for him because he was finals MVP, because it did feel like he kind of grew so much over the course of this split that he was going to come in and really cement that at this tournament. That very much did not happen. I do think he was exposed a bit more for some of his playstyle deficiencies that we had seen in some previous splits that maybe weren't quite as exposed across this split, but overall Zamudo still having good performances, and I think he needed something like this Garen game in order to feel a little bit better coming out of this tournament. Yuji looked really good on the Ivern, very strong pick. Spyrex was fine on the Tristana. Overall, very good game from Dragonsteel. Jerry definitely the star here. Zamudo kind of the secondary star for this team, but just being able to pick up a win at all in this circumstance, I think they're going to look back on that and at least be like, well, at least we were able to get this win over Fuego. But the what if of if Fear had actually been able to beat Fuego, if Fear beats Fuego and Dragonsteel has this result, you're looking at Dragonsteel in the top 4, and that's a pretty disappointing way for things to have gone. But overall, it is what it is. You just have to live with the fact that you weren't quite able to make it. But for Fuego, again, also playing with house money here, you would have loved to pick up another victory, but you are guaranteed top 4 regardless of what happened in this game. I do think you played relatively poorly throughout a majority of this game. ADD in particular was just not very good on the top side. He's going to get done of the game. This is one of the weakest games that anybody's played this entire tournament long. This Jax was entirely irrelevant. This is obviously not a great matchup overall for the Jax, or at least I would assume that it's not a particularly good matchup, and ADD really struggled. Blind picking Jax is just so risky, so aggressive, and he's already not had a great tournament, in my opinion. I think top lane has been very hit or miss for a lot of teams, very miss for a lot of teams, quite frankly, at this tournament. ADD has kind of been a part of that. I do not feel good about ADD going into this best of 3 stage if he's going to play like this, but everybody else on the team just kind of doing their own things. Zelt, Mataz, Virus FX, they've been kind of the stars. Even Balor Bala has been pretty good over the course of this tournament. None of them were perfect in this one. Bala in particular, a couple of really bad Nautilus engages that I just would probably take back if I were him. Mataz, I think, lost pressure in the same way that I was criticizing XU for doing in the game that they had just played before this. But overall, again, they were playing with house money. Regardless of the outcome here, the only thing that was really up in the air was their seeding. And depending on who they want to face, you might actually make an argument that, you know, losing this game isn't the worst thing in the entire world. But at least for now, there are things that this team needs to fix. As much as we were talking about them as a team you have to watch out for, they're not perfect. And the expectations still were that they were going to be a relatively, you know, clean game to play against, I would say, from a lot of teams at this tournament. So this isn't a shocking outcome. It's just shocking that it came at such an inopportune time. Unfortunately for Dragonsteel, this win is going to be, you know, really one of their only good memories, I would say, from this tournament. Hopefully they can, you know, build upon this and, you know, stick around maybe Scrim Fear and try to help them out and, you know, get back to the States regardless of what happens with the guest spot in the LCS. I hope they can look back on this game and on this tournament and say, well, we at least learned a lot and we learned where we needed to improve, because if you can have more games like this moving forward, then I don't think you're going to run into a problem like this again. But then moving on now to our fourth game here of day number 3, and we were talking about the last one being for Pride. This one very much not for basically anything, very much for Pride. It's VKS Academy taking on WAP Esports, and VKS is going to pick up yet another victory. It's definitely good for them to be able to pick this up. It makes things a lot easier for tiebreakers for them down the stretch. It could potentially get them into that number 3 or number 2 seed, kind of depending on how things go for the rest of this tournament. But, you know, trying to avoid being that number 4 seed is certainly going to be ideal. You don't want to play whichever team is coming into that tournament the hottest. But for VKS in particular, they just continue to have, I hate to say one game plan, but one idea for how they might want to play out a lot of their mid games, and a lot of teams just aren't really able to execute against that. Worth noting that for WAP, in this final game, they were already eliminated. They're winless at this tournament. They did sub out Diddy in the mid lane for Raiden. I don't think this really matters. Raiden was their coach coming into this. I don't know all that much about Raiden going into this, and so I don't know if he has like a full competitive experience playing mid lane. I'm sure he does if they're subbing him in for this tournament, but Raiden did come in the mid lane, and we'll talk about how that didn't really end up working out at all for WAP, but as per usual, player of the game for VKS is going to go to Kisei in the mid lane. It just feels so reliable that they are able to play through him, and that's kind of what I'm talking about when I say this team kind of has one style that they like to go towards and that they like to play the mid game through, and that's getting Kisei inside lanes, getting him as many resources as possible, and just allowing him to win a lot of these late game 5v5s. Once he's generated like a 3k gold lead, the damage difference in this game was absurd. I think a lot of people are going to laugh at some of the score lines, but when you look at the damage numbers, Kisei legit did 40,000 more damage than Raiden did his lane opposition on the other side. He did way more than basically anybody in the game. It was genuinely ridiculous. Raiden was obviously the lowest damage in the game outside of the Rel, which is really not ideal, but Kisei just absolutely massacred this mid lane matchup. He has been exceptional in the back half of this tournament. My only concern when it comes to VKS and Kisei in particular is it does feel like it is a bit one-dimensional in terms of the style that they want to go towards. He doesn't really seem like a player that you can put on something more facilitative, something more passive, and try to play for Morteus, or try to play more for Tyrion in the top lane, or Sorolu in the jungle. It just doesn't feel like this team has many different styles in terms of how they've won over the course of this tournament. It's been getting Kisei into a side lane, getting him, you know, 2.5k gold leads on his own against his mid lane opposition, and just allowing him to go to work in a lot of these late game fights. That absolutely can work. We've seen it at this tournament. It can be a reliable way to win games, but teams that are a little bit more accustomed to that style might be able to take away some of the more aggressive options in the mid lane. We're already seeing Yone and Tristana be taken off the board. I think the Elise being such a problem for a lot of teams definitely, you know, adds a wrinkle into that equation, and he is very good on a lot of different champions, but if you can get him out of that style, I'm not sure VKS is going to be as good when they have to play a bit of a different tempo, but at least for now, it's definitely working. I think a lot of that credit has to go to Sorolu and Telas, who both are very good facilitators. Both are really good at setting up players like Kisei to look really good in matchups like this. I thought Morteus was pretty good here on the Kai'Sa tier and fine on the Gnar. Overall, just good showing from VKS. I think if there was a negative, Thorin was actually pretty strong in this game on the Darius. He had basically all of the gold for WAP on the other side of the matchup, and you didn't do a great job of countering that with the R5, but outside of that, it was basically a perfect game from a macro perspective, understanding what their win conditions are and where they are comfortable. But for WAP on the other side, you know, you sub in your coach into the mid lane and he gets absolutely obliterated. It is what it is. I'm not exactly sure the reason behind that decision, but Raiden is going to get done of the game. He did like 8,000 damage in this game on Corki. It's just completely unacceptable. He was down like 3k gold by 20 minutes. This game was not particularly close. Raiden looked entirely outclassed, but he is subbing in, and so I'm not going to blame him. I don't know what happened with Diddy, but he clearly wasn't going to be playing this final game, so again, it is what it is. Thorin is the one player to shout out in a positive way here for WAP, at least in terms of this final game. He has been very hit or miss, I would say, over the course of this tournament. There really have not been a lot of like neutral games from him. He played pretty well here, and that was good, but there have been a lot of games at this tournament that he insta-lost for his team, and I don't think he was particularly good, especially, hearing all the hype that he was getting coming into this. I just wasn't particularly impressed with his tape. I think Kindless is the other player at this tournament that you look back and you go like, well, Kindless played pretty well. I think that there were definitely some positives. I think if he had, better players setting him up in a lot of these situations, perhaps that could have gone better. QQ Moore had a couple of good games, even if he did really struggle in this one. Shuhari, I don't think was particularly good at this tournament. I hate to say it, but WAP just felt kind of outclassed in a lot of different areas in this one, and it is what it is. You come out of this tournament without a win. Hopefully you can look back on some of the individual performances and try to build upon that, but this is already a team that was kind of a Frankenstein's monster. They basically flipped the entire team right before playoffs. They were able to win playoffs, get into this tournament, and it just didn't end up working out for them here. I don't think this is a huge surprise to really anybody who was watching them, before this tournament. I think we all expected them to be one of, if not the weakest team at the tournament, but not to win a game, I think is definitely disappointing in these best of ones. Hopefully they can turn it around domestically next year. But for VKS, with your spot already secured in that top 4, this is basically just playing for seeding. You probably don't want to be that number 4 seed, as I talked about, so this win does end up mattering in that regard, but again, they are very, very much locked in on their playstyle, getting early advantages and letting Kisei dominate in a side lane to be able to play through that in the late game. If they're taken off of that, we'll see what ends up happening in those situations, but they've definitely looked better over the back half of this tournament than they did at the start. But then moving on to our final game of the round robin stage, of the group stage here, if you will, and it's another banger of a game here between Pain Academy and Fear x Starforge that Pain is just barely going to pick up a win in. This is a huge victory for Pain. This puts them alone at 4-1 at the top of the standings. That means they are the number 1 seed going into the bracket stage of America's Challengers for Fear. I would love to sit here and be like, well, this game was super close, and you had options, and you understood your win conditions. All you had to do was play through the smolder, and unfortunately, it didn't work out, because sometimes games like this just don't work out. This is what happens when you opt into scaling. Sometimes you just get hands diffed, and you have to live with that, but for Fear to play 2 games like this in one day, golly, man, I would be so mental boomed. I'm gonna be honest, like, if I played the same game twice and it was this game, I would lose my mind. And so hopefully they're gonna be just fine. They're still going into the playoffs relatively fine at 3-2. They're gonna be going in as the number 3 seed, I believe, and that's not the worst. Like, not having to play Pain again in the first round, I certainly think is an advantage. And, we'll talk about how the standings end up going at the end of the video, but for Pain, this team is just really good. I've seen so much discourse online. You see it in the comments section of YouTube videos where these games are played. You see it on Reddit where stuff like this is very common, Twitter replies, where a lot of the conversation on this game in particular has been surrounded on this idea that NA is actually super overrated and that Tier 2 and NA is actually really bad and that teams that are investing in it are really stupid. And I want to make it abundantly clear. I don't want there to be any sort of gray area on how I feel about this topic. If you think that way, I think you are dumb. Like, I don't want there to be any sort of gray area on that conversation. There is just no way that people with context clues and the ability to think with actual, like, long-term stability can believe that and cannot see what we've seen over the past, like, 5 years be, like, when you are able to succeed really well at the Tier 2 level, you actually can make that transition really easily. I just think that we were underestimating the value and the talent that, Tier 2 in Brazil had or Tier 2 in LATAM had. I think we were just talking up NA as if they were the only region with a good Tier 2 ecosystem, but there is a reason that the CB LoL has been able to keep recycling talent for so long, that the LLA has been able to actually field a lot of players from their region going to Worlds, and that's because these Tier 2 systems are actually really good. I do not want this conversation to be, well, NA was actually bad all along, and the hype that we've been giving these players and the hype that we've been talking about them succeeding at the LCS level, all of it was for naught, and you were an idiot if you ever thought like that. That mentality to me is just so short-sighted. It lacks any sort of context, and Generally speaking, I think it's just an argument that shouldn't be taken seriously. I wanted to touch upon that because it has been talked about a lot, and I don't get it. Like, if you have that opinion and you really want to discuss it down in the comments, let me know, but I can't understand it. Like, I do not have any sort of reason to believe that line of thinking, but I will talk about the game now. Credit to Pain for just sticking through this. It actually doesn't look all that good for them in the back half of this game. Not only are you down in gold for the most part going into the back half, but Fear have a really fed Smolder, and Blaze Olive is doing a ton of damage in these fights. It doesn't look particularly easy to win this game, but all it takes is one fight. All it takes is one moment where you are able to ace the enemy team and find that avenue back in, and all of a sudden it's over. And a lot of that is off the back of having damage coming out from players like Marvin and players like Tatu, who I thought were really good in the back half of this game, but it was a team effort. This had to be a 5v5 kind of difference, and that's what we saw here. Even with Fear being in a better position, in my opinion, than what Pain were in, Pain were still able to close it out, and I think regardless of the gold lead in favor of the CB LOL in this one, I don't think either team should be looking at it all that negatively. Marvin is going to get player of the game. I've been so impressed with Marvin over the course of this tournament. I would argue that in comparison to my expectations, no player in the entire tournament has overachieved that more than Marvin. I came in thinking like, okay, well, this team is good. They play around top side. You know, Kotz is really good in the mid lane. Marvin's kind of this young rookie that they're trying to, you know, see what they have in. And Marvin has been probably their best player or most consistent player at this tournament. Hedon has obviously been excellent on the top side as well. Tatu is like a really highly talked about prospect, but Marvin has really been excellent. And I want to make that, you know, a point. Like, honestly, he's like a favorite for tournament MVP right now for me. Like, he has just been really, really good for Pain, really consistent, and he knows how to play a lot of these late fights. His mechanics are insane. This guy's actually really good. Hedon and Tatu continue to look very good as well. Hedon was kind of the star of day number 1 for Pain when they were really kind of overachieving on that first day. Now, I think Hedon has really settled into this spot where you can just rely on him. He can take over games really at any moment. He has the mechanical skill to be able to do that, but he's not needed in a lot of these circumstances in the sense that you don't want to take away his ability to play side lanes as well. So when he's needed in the back half, he can jump in and, you know, hit a great counter strike and set everything up to work really well for Pain, but you don't have to play through top lane, which I think is nice. It's good flexibility. Tatu continues to look really good. Kotz, Geegs, I think all of them look really good. Pain honestly just looks like the best team at the tournament right now, and that's not what I expected. And instead of tearing down NA for that being the case, let's prop up Pain in the CB LOL Academy for that being the case, for this team being as good as they are. It's really exciting to see. But for Fear on the other side, already talked about it a bit. I would be so tilted, like so mental boomed after this game if you were in this position. Once again, the same as you were against Fuego earlier on in the day and you just couldn't quite get the job done again. It's definitely a frustrating way to end off the round robin, especially because they were your only 2 losses of the entire stage, but that is in and of itself kind of an encouraging sign that your only losses were in incredibly close, incredibly back and forth games where you had options to win and it just didn't end up happening. I think if there is a concern, it's that they did kind of get hands diffed in a couple of these games, like in the back half 5v5, they did just kind of get outplayed here by Pain, and that was kind of the case against Fuego as well. But if you can get yourself into stronger early game positions, I understand that Fear is a little bit more comfortable playing for the mid to late game, playing around ABO in some of these fights, but if you can actively get yourself into good spots early, like this team has already shown in a consistent ability to at the very least get and maintain resources and understand where their win conditions are. I think that is the core of winning in League of Legends, and even if that didn't work today, I think that there still is a lot to build around. I'm not panicking about Fear. This still is a team that can absolutely win this tournament. If this was a best of 5 like game number 1, there is no reason to believe that Fear could not come back in a series like this. But I do have to give dud of the game to someone, so it is going to go to Winsome. It felt like he wasn't particularly impactful here on the Nautilus. It just didn't really feel comfortable giving this to anybody else. Philip, XU, and Blaze Olive all had their moments. ABO was obviously kind of the star for this team in terms of the damage, but just couldn't quite capitalize on that enough in the end. Philip, I thought, had a really good game. XU was generally fine here on the Viego, but Instinct and Winsome not really all that effective down in the bot lane. Marvin being the most valuable player in the bot lane, like 2v2 was really not good, I would say, for Fear overall, and that's kind of what ended up costing them. But I don't think this was a one-player diff or anything like that. I think this just was Pain being really good, and I think moving forward, you just have to hope that you can get back on track. We know that Fear can hand stiff Pain. We know that they can be better than them, especially if they have big leads in the early game, which I think is totally possible. I'm not freaking out here if you're a fan of Fear, and I'm certainly not like freaking out if I'm a fan of Pain. I think right now, this team's confidence is at an all-time high, and with them being like the host nation, you know, them getting a rematch against potentially their biggest arch rivals in the first round, potentially trying to get that out of the way early, we could potentially be looking at Pain Gaming being the champions of this entire tournament. All right, but that is going to do it for day number 3 of America's Challengers. We now know our first 2 teams, unfortunately, to be eliminated, WAP Esports and Dragonsteel. Definitely not the 2 that we were expecting. WAP, a little bit more understandable. Dragonsteel, a huge upset to be going out in the round robin stage here, but because of that, we do know our top 4 teams. And up on the screen, you can of course see the updated bracket. This is going to be what we have for the rest of this tournament. 4 teams remaining, a couple of best of 3s, a couple of best of 5s. The only best of 5s are going to be the semifinals, so the lower bracket finals, and then of course grand finals. Everything else is a best of 3, and so you still got to be on your tiptoes. Like, you can't be dropping games for no reason. That's something that a couple of teams at this tournament have really struggled with. There really hasn't been as much consistency as maybe you were expecting, but the first round matchup's definitely the most intriguing. We get a CBLOL Academy finals rematch here with Pain Gaming taking on VKS Stars, and, you know, that's going to be interesting. VKS have been kind of Pain Gaming's kryptonite in the last couple of months, and so for Pain to kind of look like the best team at this tournament for their one loss in the group stage to be against VKS, this certainly makes that a lot more interesting for what I would consider to be the tournament favorites at the moment. And then we have Fuego taking on Fear x Starforge. This is also a very intriguing matchup. Fear would be expected to be pretty major favorites in this series, and they still are going into this, but Fuego got that number 2 seed, and they earned it. They beat Fear on the final day, and so if they can just repeat that performance, if you can perhaps take Fear into these late games that clearly they struggle in, then perhaps that could be another avenue, but Fear are probably the favorites to turn that result around in a best of 3. But let me know if you agree or disagree with those, predictions and the conversation down in the comments section below. And that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit subscribe. Of course, we'll be covering the rest of America's Challengers over the course of the month, but we will, of course, also be doing our Worlds coverage. A lot of that stuff starts coming out very, very soon. Meta report, top 20 players at the tournament, and of course, my primer for every single team. All of that stuff will be coming out before the World Championships. We'll cover every single game, as we always do. If you're interested in that stuff, hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all